On November 4th, 2019, it was a clear and windless day in the state of Sonora in the northwest of Mexico. Around 1 in the afternoon, an explosion similar to a bomb shook the peace of the residents of La Mora. A community made up mostly of Mormons descended from the LeBarón family. When they left their house and looked toward the place of the explosion, they saw a column of black smoke rising from the highway. Among the hills of the Sierra Madre Occidental, messages started arriving on the residents' cell phones. Minutes later, a video. A man had gotten close enough to the scene of the fire to discover that at the center of it all was a burned-out pickup truck. Shortly before, that vehicle had left the town with a woman behind the wheel. The woman's name was Ronita Maria Milla, and she was traveling with her 4 children. They were all inside the vehicle burned. Immediately, the community mobilized. Ronita and her family hadn't left alone. There were 2 other trucks missing with 2 adult women and more children, some of them babies. But what was happening? Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The massacre of the LeBarón family marked a turning point in Mexico's recent history. The Mormon community, which has lived in the area since 1924, was completely devastated by a tragedy, which left a terrible toll: 3 women and 6 children murdered. However, this incident was not isolated, adding to Mexico's long history of organized crime-related massacres. The truth is that the LeBarón family seems destined for endless tragedy. Kidnappings, threats, and deaths have put in check a community that until not long ago was known for its peaceful, devout life and close contact with nature. When death hovered over them, questions began to arise. Unstoppable. Are they the target of a drug cartel? Did they owe money? What about those theories that say they wanted to steal land and water? Was it a crime committed to destabilize the Mexican government, or was it a mistake that led to a massacre? Ultimately, what terrible motives could there be behind a crime whose youngest victims were only 8 months old? To answer these and other questions, let's dive into the tragic and dark case of the LeBarón family massacre. El Errante. To understand the characteristics of a family like the LeBaróns, it's necessary to go back many generations, and many more people than we could have imagined at first. This story really began in 1845, when the Mormons established Salt Lake, Utah. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had emerged in 1830. But a decade and a half later, they had several branches, including the most fundamentalist group that settled in Utah with the idea of establishing a lasting community. But quickly, the United States government saw this group as a threat to its governance. They feared the group wanted to form their own state, so they decided to expel them. The most effective measure was to ban the practice of polygamy, something common and even expected in that community. The measure was effective, and several leaders decided to leave the country in search of another place where they could live under their own rules. One of these leaders was Alma Dyer LeBarón, who reached the border between Chihuahua and Sonora with the approval of the Mexican government. There, the Mormons, considered a community persecuted for their ideology, were granted asylum. As a result, they seized control of a region in northern Mexico, and LeBarón formed his own church, which over time led him to found an entire town known as Colonia LeBarón in the state of Sonora. A few kilometers away, another Mormon settlement emerged over time in Rancho La Mora in the municipality of Bavispe. In this way, the family began to grow exponentially. Along with polygamy, there was an inclination toward big families, which persists today. The LeBarón family tree became really lush, and it became common for each man to have an average of 50 children with several different wives. Unsurprisingly, the number of grandchildren quickly reached the hundreds. For example, it's estimated that great-grandfather LeBarón, the one who founded the town, had 10,000 direct descendants. 4 generations passed while waiting. Meanwhile, they started communicating with nearby communities as the town began feeling too small. The main industry that supported the population from its beginnings was the planting of walnut trees and the commercialization of their nuts. But as the family grew, job opportunities began to dwindle, and many young people decided to try their luck in the United States. Thus, the map of influence of the LeBarons expanded along with their birth rate. But the new century brought new challenges and unexpected dangers for the peaceful community. The violence, which was starting to hit hard in different parts of Mexico, ended up crossing the walls of a town that had its own rules but was not completely isolated. In 2009, the so-called war against drug trafficking intensified throughout the country, and in Sonora, the presence of organized crime groups began to be felt. On May 2nd of that year, the LeBarón family suffered the first blow firsthand. But they didn't suspect that this would be just a brush, the mildest prelude to a horror that would come a decade later. The LeBarón surname made it to the crime pages of Mexican newspapers for the first time due to a case surrounded by tensions and mysteries. Eric LeBarón was 17 years old when he was kidnapped by an alleged drug cartel that demanded a ransom of 1 million Mexican pesos. The news received wide coverage and sparked an unexpected debate when the LeBarón family publicly announced that they had no intention of paying a single cent. Benjamin LeBarón became one of the spokespersons for the clan, and he explained to television cameras and newspapers that they fervently wished for Eric to be released, but that they would not play the game proposed by the mafias. In a risky move, some saw that the family was standing up to the criminal organizations. That was admired by many, but it also triggered a counterattack from the kidnappers. However, history proved the LeBarón family right, and Eric was released unharmed. 8 days later, the young man returned to his family, and that seemed like the end of a nightmare that was actually just beginning. The media debated at length the LeBarón family's decision not to pay the ransom, and some predicted that this could have short-term consequences. What would the cartels do if they felt that, in the media, a Mormon family had stood up to them and won? The answer came shortly after, and this time the target was Benjamin LeBarón himself, the highest profile member of the entire family. The 32-year-old activist seemed to be emerging as a future leader. Anti-cartel, but that couldn't happen. On July 7, 2009, just 2 months after Eric's kidnapping, a group of 10 heavily armed men stormed Benjamin's house. They beat and tortured him in front of his family, and then took him away while they were putting him into a van. Benjamin's brother-in-law, Luis Whitmar, defended him, but was also captured by the drug traffickers. The ending is just what you can already imagine. Both were executed not far from the town, and that double murder remained as a direct message to the heart of the clan. But the group proved itself united and strong once again. The murders of Benjamin and Luis were the push that made more people with the surname rise up, calling for peace in Mexico. Over the next decade, Julian LeBarón followed in Benjamin's footsteps as the spokesperson. On his part, Alex LeBarón González entered politics and became a congressman for the Institutional Revolutionary Party, when it seemed that, despite their resilience, the LeBarón family had arisen from the ashes once again. A massacre was being planned that would surpass all limits and once again put the family in the eye of a ruthless storm, a terrible ambush. When Ronita Maria Miller, 30 years old, put 4 of her children in the car and headed toward Phoenix International Airport in Arizona, she was so happy that she never thought fate seemed to be telling her not to make that trip. Her husband had traveled to the United States 2 weeks earlier. On November 4th, 2019, she eagerly awaited his return. She had planned to go meet him with her 8-month-old twins and her 2 older children. But after moving forward a few meters, one of the tires blew out and Ronita decided to turn back. She went to a relative's house and explained the situation. She was determined to go surprise her husband and make his return joyful, but suddenly she was left without a vehicle. They quickly lent her a truck and she got back on the road, this time in a caravan. Donna Ray Langford, 43, and Christina Mary Langford Johnson, 29. They were going to a wedding in 2 other trucks and would take a similar route, so they decided to leave all together. There were more children in Dawn and Christina's cars. In total, spread among the 3 cars, there were 14 kids of different ages. Among the more or less direct members of the LeBarón family, it was common for any plan to involve a large group. In this way, the women set out in a line on the road from La Mora, and further along the way, their paths would diverge. But they only managed to travel a few kilometers, just enough for their relatives to hear an explosion, followed by the sound of gunfire. At a certain point on the map, between the towns of San Miguelito in Sonora and Pancho Villa in Chihuahua, something brutally changed the course of events. When the neighbors of La Mora saw a fire in the mountains, they went to see what was happening. A video captured the horrifying scene of the car Ronita had borrowed just minutes earlier, now reduced to ashes. Only the metal skeleton of the sport utility vehicle remained, and inside were the remains of her and her 4 children. And that's how our story returns to the beginning. The news left the whole LeBarón family in shock. No one could believe what was happening. Tragedy was haunting them again, and this time it was worse than their worst imaginable nightmare. As the news that Ronita and her children had died in a fire reached everyone, one question drove the whole town to start a desperate search. Where were the cars of Donna, Cristina, and the other 10 children? Did they take them? They immediately called the prosecutor's offices in Chihuahua and Sonora, but help wasn't coming. The authorities told them it was a hard-to-reach area and that they didn't have fuel in the helicopters to start the official search. So, with the resources they had on hand, they took off and decided to search on foot themselves. What had happened to the rest of their family members? The main fear was that the women and children had been kidnapped by the drug traffickers. Ronita and her children's deaths clearly showed they were attacked by a cartel, leaving no room for other hypotheses. It seemed like that story of Eric's kidnapping was repeating itself, like a curse the family couldn't escape. For hours and hours they searched, covering as much ground as possible, driving along the roads as the afternoon faded and night began to fall. Still without help from official agents, they searched through the shadows, praying that the shapes appearing along the way were not the bodies of their loved ones. The nightmare finally became reality when they reached the gap. The bodies of Donna and Cristina were lying in the middle of the road. They had been gunned down. But that wasn't all. The truck stopped on the same road also had marks of dozens of gunshots on the doors, windshields, and tires. Inside the vehicles, the bodies of Trevor Harvey Lanford, 11 years old, and Rogan J. Lanford, a 2-year-old baby, lay as the final confirmation of the horror that had just been unleashed. In that community, there were 9 fatal victims and many children were still missing. In one of the seats, there was room for a miracle. A 7-month-old baby girl sat in the carrier, dirty and exhausted, lacking the energy to cry, but alive. 10 hours post-attack, news arrived bringing relief to the LeBarón Mackenzie family. One of the missing girls had wandered aimlessly for 8 kilometers with a gunshot wound in her arm until she was found by her uncle. She had gotten out of the bullet-riddled car to look for help and got lost. One of the older children, 13-year-old Devin, hid his little siblings in the bushes, and he ran 15 kilometers looking for someone who could help him in the middle of that ordeal. Of the 14 children who had left the village that afternoon, 6 had died, and the others had been shot. That was too much, and the questions only kept growing. The news of the massacre quickly gained international relevance. Since it happened so close to the border, the matter became a regional political issue. The following day, Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador expressed regret over the incident at a press conference, while United States President Donald Trump did the same on Twitter. The tension between the two presidents remained, despite the circumstances. López Obrador rejected the help from the United States, and Trump pushed his own agenda by asking the neighboring country to declare war on drug trafficking and to wipe out those monsters. But on a more domestic level, the LeBaróns were going through a real hell. The funeral of the 9 fatal victims completely shattered the usual fighting spirit of the Mormon family. The aftermath for the children who survived the attack marked the start of a long journey. Some of the little ones had been seriously injured in the shooting, but nothing compared to the emotional trauma of having witnessed such an atrocity. The case that dominated the media in late 2019, but was eventually overshadowed by the pandemic outbreak. A few weeks later, Sumo raised questions that in some cases were a bit more than uncomfortable. The official theory of the Mexican government was mostly that the tragedy suffered by the LeBarón family was basically the result of a misunderstanding. Under this idea, they were investigating the possibility that the drug cartel that attacked the convoy had another target and simply mistook the victims. But some questioned how it was possible for the narcos to riddle cars with bullets and set them on fire while people were inside. 14 children under 12 years old. Thinking it was a rival cartel, unfortunately, there were some precedents. On the night of September 26th to 27th, 2014, 43 students from Ayotzinapa were kidnapped and disappeared. The main hypothesis is that they were mistaken for a cartel, although in reality they were traveling to a student protest. However, many analysts believe this was not a likely possibility in the LeBarón case. The other option, even more disturbing, suggested that for a decade, the drug cartels operating in that area of Mexico had been determined to decimate the Mormons. With what objective? Possibly territorial, to remove them from the area where they had settled years ago and take control of the entire region? It was possible the land was not being directly disputed by a cartel against the LeBarón family, but rather that the Mormons had ended up caught in the middle of a war between organizations that both wanted to take over this place. But, regardless of which hypothesis came closest to explaining the events, the question remained, who had been responsible for killing the women and children? Where had the horrifying order to levy come from? As time passed, suspects and specific names emerged. Over the course of 4 years, investigations revealed that many more people than originally thought had taken part in the massacre. In total, 33 people were arrested. One of the family spokesmen, Adrian LeBarón, whose daughter and grandson were murdered, welcomed the news. One of the names that emerged as a possible instigator of the massacre was José Osvaldo Vázquez Borrego, also known as Coma Peter, an alleged operator of the New Juarez cartel, the organization believed responsible for the massacre. In the weeks prior, agents from the Secretariat of National Defense and the Federal Ministerial Police had arrested Martin N., identified as another mastermind. In the following years, the number of detainees rose to 36, and Adrian LeBarón reinforced his request for the case to be considered and investigated as a case of terrorism. Convictions started coming in by late 2023. Fidel Alejandro, also known as El Chiquilin, was found guilty of the crime of organized crime and was considered part of the armed wing of the Juarez cartel. In La Línea, El Chiquilin had ties to drug traffickers, leading to an escalated massacre in the area's shadiest part. At the same time, he was Llanos' director of municipal public security. This raised the grim possibility that the massacre may have occurred, thanks to the political protection that some of these groups received from certain sectors of the municipal leadership. If that were the case, the scheme would be much more complex and darker than a simple mistake, as the official hypothesis had suggested. This paved the way for a conspiracy to conceal the truth. Fidencio Alejandro G., also known as El Llanos, was another convicted individual linked to the line. However, the LeBarón family felt his 12-year prison sentence was insufficient. The family appealed the sentence and warned about the risk that the massacre would remain in impunity. On the side of the mastermind, Leonardo Luján Saucedo, also known as Chamona, was targeted, but as of the time this video was filmed, he has not received any sentence. In fact, despite all those investigated, the passing years have left the community with the feeling that it will never be completely clear. What happened on November 4th, 2019? 5 years after the massacre, the LeBarón community had changed irrevocably. The first direct consequence was fear, the second was the exodus. In the months following the massacre, fear settled in the different Mormon family groups, and many decided to get as far away as possible from La Mora and those places where they had settled, amid a media campaign that at times became especially critical of the LeBarón family. They were even accused of wanting to take over natural resources or being linked to Chapo Guzman. The tension in the air intensified. It's worth clarifying that the members of this Mormon community were accused of committing constant beatings, child marriages, and other abuses. In the memoir The Polygamist's Daughter, written by a woman who escaped from the clan, Ana LeBarón, for many people, even though they appear vulnerable, the LeBarón family has terrible secrets that have yet to come to light. In the documentary LeBarón, Death in the Promised Land, all the dark aspects of this case are investigated, and there is a special reflection on what happened after the massacre. Entire areas that were once inhabited by Mormon families became ghost towns. Even entire valleys in northern Mexico were left depopulated. The LeBarón family themselves and other descendants from the same family line gave testimony in the documentary for a single reason. They feel that the justice system and media have re-victimized them over the years, which they say is common for most victims of armed violence in Mexico. The violence in Mexico continued before, during, and after these events. In the last 6 years, according to British Broadcasting Corporation data, there have been 115,000 missing people and 72,100 bodies that entered forensic medical services without being identified. The LeBarón family, like many others, is still waiting for answers while they move farther away on the horizon, searching for a place they can call home. Even today, they can still be seen emigrating. They say that, above all, they wish their last name would stop being a curse.